beautiful shot. New York City, 40 past the hour. The UN General Assembly meets this week in New York City, and it comes just days after the Trump administration announced it is deploying military forces to the Middle East after recent attacks on Saudi Arabian oil sites and facilities. Joining us now, former U.S. Secretary of State under President Obama, John Kerry. Great to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Great to be here with you.
Obviously, a big week this week in New York with the UN General Assembly. I have a lot going on in the Middle East with Iran's alleged attacks against the Saudi oil facilities. Netanyahu apparently shaken from power in Israel. What are your concerns as we go into this week, especially as it pertains to the ongoing unrest in the Middle East?
Well, my concerns are whether adults are going to show up and do what they ought to be doing in terms of diplomacy to pull back from the brink and to avoid the real potential of, if not accidental war, of a war of choice. This is unnecessary. What is happening right now is completely unnecessary. It is happening in a foreseeable and foreseen manner because we said if you don't deal with Iran's nuclear program and deal properly with the other issues in a diplomatic channel, you are going to have confrontation. People didn't really take that seriously a number of years ago when we said it. We still got the agreement, but now it's real. It's very real.
And what should our stance be with Saudi Arabia? Obviously, they've been a key strategic ally for decades. There are, of course, some serious concerns with leadership there, serious concerns about the ongoing war in Yemen. But again, they are our allies. How do we address this crisis looking at Saudi Arabia, looking at Iran, looking at American interests across that region?
Well, good diplomacy is helping people sometimes to understand their own interests. And I think that in this case, Saudi Arabia has real interests in seeking an end to the war in Yemen. Actually, Iran could play a role in that if we had the proper diplomacy and efforts going. I believe that there is a way to resolve the question of Iran itself and its nuclear program and the security issues of the region. But you need a strategy that's prepared to open up the possibilities of diplomacy. If you are, as the administration is right now, saying, here are the 12 things you have to do, and there's no real incentive that deals with the lack of credibility the administration now has because they're the ones who broke the deal. This was extremely difficult for Rouhani to come to the table. The IRGC and the hardliners in Iran didn't want this deal. That should tell you something about the effectiveness of the deal. But the hardliners create a politics for Iran that this administration is not dealing with in any way. Right now, because the supreme leader went way out on the limb, allowing Rouhani to negotiate this agreement, he was told again and again, don't negotiate with the United States, the great Satan. You can't do that. They'll burn you. Well, guess what? Donald Trump came along and burned them. The deal was working. Our allies were for it. They're still for it. And there's been no effort to bring our allies to the table in a way that we show Iran what is possible here and what the administration is willing to do in terms of sanctions or otherwise if we move forward. So unless something happens to change that equation, there won't be the kind of meetings that ought to take place. I think the administration ought to use our allies to greater effect here, to open up a channel of communication, create a regional dialogue, and begin to put on the table something real for what the positive outcome can be, because Iran has no reason to trust anything that Donald Trump says. For that matter, most Americans don't either.
Well, and with that, I'd like to move to the Ukraine story. I'd love to get your reaction and what the crucial questions that come to your mind when you hear about the Wall Street Journal reporting that the president reached out to the leader of Ukraine potentially 8 times. We don't know the exact wording of these conversations yet. But
it was to interfere, to speak with Rudy Giuliani on this investigation.
What's your reaction, Mr. Secretary?
Well, Mika, my reaction is one of absolute shock and amazement that apparently within hours of or days of the Mueller testimony, the president is on the telephone putting American foreign policy in hock while he extorts the leader of another country to Russia's advantage, I might add. I mean, here's another instance of the president putting the heat on saying to the country we're trying to help, resist Russia, and he turns around and says, I'm going to take your aid away unless you become the opposition research center for my campaign for President of the United States. That is a fundamental, profound abuse of power. There's no other way to put it. And the president said yesterday, oh, we had a beautiful conversation. Mr. President, show America what that beautiful conversation was. Let us see how beautiful it really was. Let us know whether 8 times you turned around and tried to extort from the president your campaign opposition research. And by the way, it's the Wall Street Journal that printed this story. It'll be the first time I've ever heard the Wall Street Journal called fake news by a Republican president of the United States.
Mr. Secretary, can we come back to the Iran situation for a second? You're talking about giving Iran some incentive in order to climb down. What is it that we, though, would demand? Would you basically argue to the administration or to a Democratic candidate that we ought to go back into the 2015 agreement, or has too much time passed and we now basically ought to move the goalposts and say we'd be willing to release sanctions, but only if, for example, we extended the duration of the agreement or we included missiles or dealt with, what's your approach?
I think we're at a point here, Richard, where there is time that has passed, and the situation in the Middle East is fluid, and it has changed. We always intended, it was our intention to first take the nuclear potential off the table. But we always intended to pursue the follow-on agreement. And the follow-on agreement is resolving Yemen, dealing with the relationship with Hezbollah, getting some agreement about the fundamental security arrangement of the region so that you don't have Iran on a daily threat to Israel. You have to deal with the missiles that are arrayed in Lebanon through Hezbollah that are a threat to Israel. All of those are, and you know, meddling in other countries. By the way, other countries in the region are meddling in other countries. So there has to be a coming together of a reality check for this region. This is the single least integrated economic region in the world, single least security integrated region in the world. And that has gone on year after year after year. What is being missed in the Middle East in terms of economic growth, development, the potential for a peaceful future is shocking. I believe there are leaders there who are prepared to come together around a genuine strategy that lays out a vision for what the upsides would be. And I believe with respect to Iran, that there is a way, I'm convinced of this, Iran is prepared to negotiate on those other items. But you've got to first prove your bona fides that you're going to negotiate in good faith. And they came to this table reluctantly. They didn't trust the process. We built that up over years of work, hours of negotiations. We got to a place where we eliminated the nuclear threat. We would know. It doesn't mean they might not decide in the future to go try to break out, but we would know it. And every military option available to us today would be available to us then. So we didn't lose anything in creating this. Donald Trump lost it. He turned away from our allies. He turned away from Russia, China, France, Germany, Britain, who are still in this agreement. And now I believe the ground is ripe to find a way to come back to the fundamentals of the agreement, perhaps a few changes, but more profoundly, to wrap it into a larger, integrated, regional security arrangement for the Middle East. That's where we ought to go. And this could be, if you exercise and execute that diplomacy, this could be a big moment for the region. But it also could be a very negative moment.
You know, I have a question within a question. And the first question, before we wrap the other question in, is we opened this segment, we opened today, this hour, with a clip from Mike Pompeo, who was asked about the whole thing going on with the Ukraine and President Trump. And he basically said, well, it's on Joe Biden because he tried to do something ridiculously corrupt with the Ukraine when he was vice president. So my question about that is, you served in the Senate for a couple of decades. Why do you think so many people, Republicans in the Senate and in the House, sell their soul to this man, Donald Trump? Okay, what happens there internally? And then on an entirely different subject, but maybe not, the national security implications of climate change.
Well, I'm really sad for what has happened to the United States Senate. I was privileged to be there for 28 years. There are always political considerations and complications, but never have I seen people talk privately and acknowledge that they know this is wrong, that they know there's a lack of balance in this presidency. That's a polite way of putting it. And yet they don't do anything about it. And the reason is there's a fear of primaries, the fear of the president himself churning up his base, and that they somehow are going to pay the price for that. There's just fear of not being reelected. We don't see the statespeople necessary. I remember President Kennedy said there was a reason that Profiles in Courage was a very thin book. There weren't a lot of profiles, and right now there are none on the Republican side. There were a few, and the other colleagues now see what happened to them. So this isn't hard to figure out. It's pretty basic politics. But the United States Senate is not supposed to be the prisoner of basic politics. That's what our founding fathers designed it to be, is something bigger, better. That's why you have a 6-year term. That's why you have different rules of debate, and the possibilities of building coalitions and being the check against the passions of the day. That's what our founding fathers put together, and that is not being honored in any way whatsoever right now, Mike.
Well, just to follow up on that, what should the Democratic leadership do? Because it seems pretty obvious that Donald Trump has committed multiple impeachable offenses.
Well,
what would you prescribe?
I think the most important thing right now is to have the investigation and get the facts. Don't jump, to the conclusion ahead of time, but it's absolutely appropriate that they thoroughly investigate and lay out this mosaic of remarkable events that have taken place. I think this most recent thing with Ukraine is quite extraordinary. And back when Richard Nixon abused power, Republicans joined in holding him accountable for it. We need to see the institutions of our country stand up here. Americans rely on that. Our nation's democracy right now is genuinely troubled. It's troubled because of the amount of money in American politics. It's troubled because of gerrymandering, which deprives people of a legitimate, full-fledged democratic general election in our nation. We're not getting budgets passed. We don't have a regular order, as my good friend John McCain used to talk about. We need to get back to it. But it takes leadership to do that. I think that it is appropriate to investigate. There is no equivalency whatsoever between what Donald Trump did and the fact that our administration, at the direction of the president, and with the professionals in the State Department making the calls, saying we need to get the corruption out of Ukraine. And it was the full administration's policy to want that prosecutor out of there. That was not an individual choice by Biden, but the phone call made by the President of the United States was an individual choice and completely outside the realm of decency and appropriateness for a president.
So you've continued, Mr. Secretary, to lead on climate, continued to go across the world talking about the need for America to not only get re-engaged in Paris, but also you've encouraged other countries to exceed those minimal requirements. And this week, obviously, where so much focus has been on the climate, is going to be on the climate at the UN. You are actually going to be talking about a new climate initiative that you're going to be heading up. Tell us about it.
Well, Joe, thank you for asking that. And I hope in the next weeks, when we really roll it out in full, I can come back with the team of people who are going to be involved.
Yes.
It's a very exciting idea. We lack political accountability with respect to climate. Even if we did every single thing that we set out to do in Paris, if every nation lived up to the Paris Agreement, we would be at 3.7 degrees of warming. And it's not because anybody was deceived by Paris. What we did in Paris was excite the marketplace with a signal that 196 countries were going to try and move in the same direction. The problem is nobody is. Emissions went up last year. They went up here in America. They went up in Europe. They went up in China. The people who are supposed to be leading aren't. So kids are out in the streets of the world saying, wait a minute, this is our world. This is our future. And you guys aren't getting the job done. And guess what? We're not. The world is not getting the job done. And the results are we're going to have massive dislocation of human beings coming at us. Part of the reason we have people coming across the border from Central America is climate change. They can't farm. They can't feed themselves. And if you think we see a problem today, wait till you see what happens if we don't respond adequately. What is so confounding about this moment, Joe and Mika, is that the American people are being lied to about this. Today, there will be a major meeting at the United Nations. Nations will come together to talk about climate change. The President of the United States is skipping that meeting. The President of the United States is saying that climate change is a Chinese hoax, when the best scientists of the world are telling us, you guys have about 10 years now to get this together, so we are reducing emissions and building a zero emissions economy by at least 2050. The tragedy of this is there are millions of jobs to be created in doing this. This is a job winner, not a job loser, as people are being told. This is an incredible opportunity for better health, reduce the particulates in the air, reduce the cancer, reduce the number of children who are the greatest cause of children being hospitalized in America in the summer is environmentally induced asthma. So if we attack this, if we do what's necessary, we'll create jobs, we'll have better health, we'll have better national security. We have admirals and generals and national security leaders, all of whom are telling people we've got to get this done. So World War Zero, go to worldwarzero.com, is going to take on the deniers and the delayers and the distorters, and we're going to try to create political accountability in this country again, the kind that brought us the Clean Air Act, the EPA, the Safe Drinking Water, all of which came out of citizen activity. The American people need to rise up and reclaim the future.
So, Mr. Secretary, before you go, of course, we won't put you in the awkward position of talking about the other Democratic candidates, but some might ask, why wouldn't you run during this crucial time for President of the United States?
Because I'm doing what I'm doing right now. How's that?
Pretty good.
Underline
Former
right
Secretary of State John Kerry.
Okay. Well, when you come back to do the full launch, we'll follow up. As Tim Russert used to say, more to come.
Yeah. Thank you very much for being on.
Thanks a lot. Great to be with you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Great to have you here.
Still ahead, a joint interview with all three of the president's Republican primary challengers, former Congressman Joe Walsh and Mark Sanford and former Governor William Weld.
And they're talking about the Republican Party canceling elections. Talk about undemocratic. Morning Joe, back in 2 minutes. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.